Good evening, everyone. And yes, you can blame me for the weather. Yes, that's fine. It's just a reputation I'll carry with me. There's a lecture, it's going to be cold and or snowing, so there we go. Welcome. I'm glad you came. And just trust that the planet is continuing to turn and it continuing to go around the sun, so it will get warmer. Just not quite sure when. Welcome to the 2014-2015 Lectures in Catholic Experience. My name is Christina Vanine. I'm Associate Dean here at St. Jerome's University, and I'm coordinating this year's lecture series. And I ask you, please, before we get started, that you would turn off any cell phones or pagers or anything that you have with you that might make some kind of noise. Thank you very much. Tonight's lecture is the inaugural Resurrectionist lecture on Christian spirituality. We're pleased that Father Murray McDermott, the Provincial Superior of the Congregation of the Resurrection, is with us this evening. He's in the, as he told me, in the very Catholic place in the back row on the right-hand side. The Congregation of the Resurrection is committed to contributing to the resurrection of society, which it understands involves both personal and communal transformation. And on the website of the Ontario-Kentucky province, they say, "We believe that God calls us to work together for the resurrection of society, bringing His life and love to all, through our personal witness and through the witness of our life in community, in which all can experience the hope, joy, and peace of Christ's resurrection." This mission is rooted in a spirituality that harnesses the power and the hope of Christ's resurrection, the transformation of persons and the world. And so it's especially appropriate then that the community has chosen to establish this lecture with a focus on Christian spirituality. And in this evening's lecture, we're going to explore the intersection between spirituality and theology, as that takes place in the lives and thought of 4 women doctors in the Church. You may be aware that Pope Francis named 5 women to serve on the 30-member International Theological Commission, which is a body that advises the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, as well as the Church in general. And when the Pope addressed the Commission as it was beginning its new 5-year term, he spoke about how pleased he was that there are now 5 women serving on this commission. In fact, he referred to the appointment of 5 women and of these women as strawberries on the cake. Now, I'm not quite sure what to do with that. I don't know what Elizabeth's going to do with that, if anything to do with that. But I'm going to move on to the rest of what he said, which is that in that same address, Pope Francis made it clear that while he was pleased that there were 5 women, the Commission needs more women theologians. He went on to say, "The greater presence of women is a call to reflect on the role that women can and must have in the field of theology. Women theologians can reveal, to the benefit of everyone, certain unexplored aspects of the unfathomable mystery of Christ." We are fortunate to have Dr. Elizabeth Dreyer with us this evening to help us with this critical reflection on the significant role of Catherine of Siena, Teresa of Avila, Thérèse of Lisieux, and Hildegard of Bingen. Dr. Dreyer is Professor Emerita of Religious Studies at Fairfield University in Connecticut. Before becoming a member of the Fairfield faculty in 1999, she taught at the College of St. Catherine in St. Paul, Minnesota, the Catholic University of America, and the Washington Theological Union in Washington, D.C. Dr. Dreyer has written several books on medieval mysticism. She also served as the general editor for the 8-volume series called to Holiness, Spirituality for Catholic Women. She herself wrote the first volume for that series, and that volume was entitled Making Sense of God, A Woman's Perspective, which was published by St. Anthony Messenger Press in 2008. And just in August 2014, her latest book, which is called Accidental Theologians, 4 Women Who Shaped Christianity, was published by the Franciscan Media. Given her lifelong scholarly commitments to knowledge and expansion of the role of women in Christianity, and to the creative, critical recovery of the Christian tradition for contemporary theology and spirituality, it is especially appropriate and an honor for us to have Dr. Dreyer here to deliver this inaugural lecture on Christian spirituality. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Dreyer to speak to us on the topic, Women in the Christian Tradition, where theology and spirituality meet. Dr. Dreyer.
Thank you for that warm welcome and for the hospitality of St. Jerome's. It's wonderful to be back here, to see old friends and to meet some new people, I hope. As I began putting this presentation together, I ended up, I think, probably short shrifting the women a little bit. That's part 3, and I'm going to do some maybe suggesting of some issues there with the women, and I'm hoping that we'll have maybe a rousing discussion with some more specific questions that you might have about the women. What I ended up doing, and sort of ran out of room in a sense, was to talk a little bit or to think a little bit about theology and spirituality, especially as this is the inaugural lecture of this topic of spirituality, and perhaps it might be a bit of a touchstone to think about as we listen to the other lectures that will come later on. The theme for this year is a culture of encounter, and these 4 women lived obviously in very different times than we, and different cultures, different everything from our experience today. And so it's not easy to go back and read them. Sometimes it's not easy to figure out what we should keep from them and what we should leave behind in the Middle Ages or the earlier periods of history. And yet, I do think they have a lot to teach us. And one of the things, and I'll explain at the end why I think these women are good at integrating theology and spirituality. But what I wanted to do first is to talk a little bit about how they started out together and how they got separated, and now in history we're trying to put them back together again. And so that'll be a little race, a bit of a race through Christian history on this question of what happened. The word spirituality is a new word in Christian history. So it's not a word that has been around for most of Christian history. And why did it come up? Why is now everyone talking about spirituality? And then in part 2, I'd like to say a little bit about what they have to do with each other. Now that we have spirituality and theology, how can they help each other, and how do they hinder each other, and how might they walk as partners into the future? And I think in the 20th century and the 21st century, we're trying to recover this holistic, this more together understanding of theology and spirituality. And then I would like to adumbrate or give a couple of hints about why I think these women doctors of the church are models in a certain way to help us, to point some ways to us about how to get this picture back together and more unified. So I'd like to begin with this run through history. So hang on to your hats. We're going to do a really quick run through this. The first thing I'd like to say is that for most of Christian history, the majority of Christian history, and the period preceding it, so Greek world of thought, the Greek philosophical system, they would not have had a clue about the topic of tonight's talk. All right, so they would go, what? Theology, spirituality, what are you talking about? So this distinction that we now make and take for granted would have been unintelligible to most of the Greek world and most of Christian history. And let me summarize a little bit, and there's some wonderful books about how the Greeks looked at philosophy. When we hear philosophy and theology, we fit, ivory tower, abstract, irrelevant to daily life, all those kinds of things. And if it is that, it's not good theology. But until the 14th century, and I'll go through that, the purpose of doing theology was to become a good person. So in Christian terms, that would be become holy. In Greek philosophical terms, it would have been talked about as becoming virtuous. So the act of doing theology was seen as a spiritual practice, like praying or fasting or doing theology. So those belong together, not separate from each other. In the 4th century, the Greek theologian Evagrius Ponticus wrote, "If you are a theologian, you pray truly, and if you pray truly, you are a theologian." So conversion of heart and intellectual inquiry went hand in hand. This understanding of theology guided the early fathers of the church from Origen to John of Damascus. Knowledge of God was participatory. So it was like learning how to swim by being thrown into the water. You did it. You didn't theorize about it and stand outside of it. Knowledge of God was participatory. So the goal was for you to learn how to be part of the Trinity, to share in the dynamic love and beauty of the Trinity. So it was to be joined to God. We take for granted that you can study something out there. So I'm here, and this thing like carbon dioxide or jellyfish. All right? So I study them, and they're out there. And even now, we have authors. Who's the wonderful author who studied corn kernels? And she talked about how she crossed over into the corn kernels, and by studying years and years and years, she became at one with the corn kernels. And as a result of that, she had insights that she wouldn't have had if she had had them completely over there, distinct from herself. So God, and we've always talked about this, but we haven't always walked the walk, God is not an object like other things. So you don't study God over there and I'm over here. That would have made no sense in most of Christian history. They would have thought you were crazy. So there was no such thing as a neutral, objective knowledge of God. The heart and the mind were linked in this theological process. So to know meant ultimately to be in conformity with God's will. It would be to think like God, to love like God as close as we could get. That's what the goal of theology and philosophy was. Remote seeds of this breaking apart, so you have this picture of these two things. So the remote seeds of their getting separated is often traced, and I'm going to qualify this in a minute, to the 12th century. So how many of you have heard of Abelard? Eloise and Abelard, okay. And his compatriot, Bernard of Clairvaux. So those two are often seen as the incipient little beginnings of a tension between theology, which is reflection on life experience, on reflection on experience of God, and the faith experience of God. Those things started to get pushed apart a little bit. So Abelard was what? He was the theologian with the penetrating mind who left no question unexplored. His drive to ferret out every contradiction in Scripture and the tradition led to a work that you may know, Sic et Non, yes and no. So here's this analytical mind going at this to say, okay, what about this? Let's sort this out. Bernard is from the monastic tradition. So he's reading the Scriptures, meditating on the Scriptures, Lectio Divina, and his theology is coming out of that kind of lecture, of reflection on the Word of God. So he was the paradigm. Bernard is the paradigm of heart spirituality, of heart affective piety. And if you read him, emotion runs off every page. Even though he can't ever say, as a 12th century person, he could never say, well, emotion is the way to God. He says, oh, be really careful of those emotions. And then on every page it's emotion, emotion, emotion. This passionate, passionate love of God. In the following century, in the 13th century, and you know from there who's the big Thomas Aquinas, all right, and Bonaventure, his colleague at the University of Paris. So reason became more important as a tool of theology. And it's not that reason wasn't important in the monastic tradition, but it became more prominent, used more widespread. It was more widespread. And so what we call scholasticism was a very analytic kind of reflection on the Word of God, reflection on experience of God. And how many of you have read the primary text of the Summa Theologiae of Thomas Aquinas? So you just have to, once you probe there, there's a lot more there, but when you look at the structure of this, he is really lining up his ducks, covering every base, every objection. So very analytical and thoughtful in terms of rational, logical organization. But I don't want to draw this too closely, this division, because until the 14th century, there's still this great mix of reason and heart. And Anselm of Canterbury would be an example, who wrote a very sophisticated theological text, Cur Deus Homo, why God, man. And also a series of beautiful, moving prayers, touching, pious, gorgeous prayers, full of heart and affectivity. In his meditation on human redemption, he wrote, "Make me taste in love what I taste in knowledge. May I perceive in my affections what I perceive in my mind." So he's got that together, even though we're moving away from keeping those things together. Bonaventure, also in his own way, he's called the seraphic doctor. Okay, seraphic, heart, doctor, head. So even in his name, we've got the two pieces. And he was, I think, unusually successful as a Franciscan. And the Franciscans are hugely responsible in the Middle Ages for keeping the heart going. Francis was definitely a heart person and not at all a book person. And Thomas Aquinas talks about connatural knowledge. So again, this idea that there's knowledge of God separate from me didn't exist even in the 13th century, even though the tension is growing. And he wrote the Pange Lingua, along with the Summa Theologiae. Everyone was writing love poetry in the 12th century. Popes wrote, the troubadours wrote poetry about love, and theologians and popes took up that literature. It influenced back and forth and wrote beautiful poems to Mary and to the saints to express this kind of affective devotion to God. Nevertheless, this spread, this tension and this growing apart was on the way. Early in the church, the focus on Christ was very cerebral. If you look at classic imagery, when the church began, when the community began to paint images and make images of Christ, I always use the Infant of Prague as an example. So you have this little 40-year-old man in the body of a baby with royal gold robes and a crown on his head, sitting on this very regal Mary lap. And so you have that image of, I just use it as a shorthand, this image of one kind of image of Christ. And then by the end of the 11th and the 12th century, you have Christ the Gerber baby. So you have Christ at Mary's feet, naked, beautiful Rembrandt cheeks, chubby, playing with a ball of yarn. And you can follow this whole story in art as well as in texts. So this devotion to the human Christ emphasized history. Ewart Cousins calls it a mysticism of the historical event. So when you have a certain kind of theology that's abstract, ahistorical, transcendent, up there, not too involved in the messiness of everyday life. And as one of these pieces that gradually gets separated away from theology is that we were involved in history, the messiness and the complexity of history. You have a God of history, so we have to think about God in terms of our everyday life. As Aristotle took over and different methodologies became interesting to scholars in the 13th century, and it became more scientific, more orderly, more attending to putting what we experience in the senses, putting them in an ordered, thoughtful kind of way. And as a result, the affections got lost in the shuffle a little bit. So you can see, you can even feel the difference between a logical syllogism and falling in love. And they're both necessary, they're both important, but they're different kinds of animals. And if you're trying to get it under a microscope, one works better than the other. Okay, so falling in love, it's kind of really slippery to get under the microscope. But some other things lend themselves to going under the microscope. The 16th century brought the Protestant Reformation, and there again, some losses. Rightly, Protestants were nervous about mysticism, about some of these pious practices that looked to them like people were earning their salvation. That they were working hard and getting involved and climbing ladders and doing all these things, and that looked like they were kind of putting salvation in the bank. And that's what Luther was trying to raise some issues about. Also the messiness, the saints, the relics. We were talking at dinner about Catherine's head, still there to be seen. Her body in another city, still there to be, it was a very, material faith. Stuff. We had a lot of stuff. It was important. And for important reasons. And I think the women, these medieval women, the doctors of the church, have this, what we call a sacramental consciousness, that the world speaks of God. And Francis and Bonaventure would be great examples of that. So the rejection of the Protestant community also caused us to lose some of this rich interior experience. Trent, in reaction to the Protestant Reformation, reformed seminaries, got a curriculum in place, and what eventually happened is that this one unified thing with the lots of pieces to it called theology became systematic theology, moral theology, ascetical theology, mystical theology, and the curriculum was set up in these distinct ways so that you were studying theology in different pieces. And there's good for that. There are good things about that, but there are also some losses about that. And eventually the losses became neuralgic, became damaging, and we're trying to correct that now. One way, theology that stayed close to the Bible in terms of form and language, which the monastic community did because they're reading the Bible and they're doing theology out of that. And scholastics are also reading the Bible, but they're looking at it and parsing it in different ways. So the mood of biblical language changes and shifts as history went on. Now, in the modern period, so where we are today, or most recently, we are fascinated with science. So you have 17th century with the discovery of mathematics, 19th century isms. Every ism you ever heard of was invented by German scholars in the 19th century. So it's a way of understanding the world. It's a way of understanding language. And the idea of truth, or what was considered acceptable as truth, became more narrowed. And an extreme kind of what I would call a extreme radical empiricism is that the only way that something is true is if I can get it under a microscope. And we're victims of that right now. So I always, when I taught undergraduates, I always talked about the different ways of understanding truth, and I'd always say, the first question is, does your mother love you? And they kind of look at me like, well, they're not sure always whether their mother does love them. But, and another way they are, but it doesn't work under a microscope. You can have evidence for it, but it doesn't fit into naturally into a syllogism. And then following in Abelard and Origen before him in the 2nd century, we started parsing the Bible in different ways. We're using historical critical methodologies. So there's something wonderful about that we're using the lingua franca of our time, which is scientific method. And you all know it's scientific method. You have hypotheses, you prove them, you have conclusions, and then a new piece of evidence come in, and you go back and you repeat the process. But it meant that other things in life are not really good indicators of what is true. Also, as theology became a member of a larger university community, this is a good example of a pluralistic, diverse university community, theologians wanted to get their bona fides. They wanted to say, well, we know how to do this scientific method also. And if you're with a whole group of intellectuals who use the scientific method, you're gonna, in good ways and bad, you're gonna imitate that because it works, because it's helpful, because it reveals wonderful insights. But people develop specialized vocabulary. So theology gets more and more specialized, more and more scientific, and what seems to be left behind is the primary source which the church used for most of its history, that the source for theology is the faith of the community. And it's a responsibility of theology to be accountable to that faith of the community. So it wouldn't make any sense for most of Christian history to write theology as though the community of faith didn't exist, that you would never consult this community. So some people lament a loss of wonder and awe, and I think sometimes scientists are our best teachers. If you talk to physicists who have kept that wow sense of looking at the universe, that's the beginning, that's the first moment of faith. It's the first moment of mysticism in a sense. And so I'm not negative on any of this, but it's just that I think the reason spirituality in the 60s came up and came forward with such a vengeance was that theology was no longer taking account of this part of the picture. And that was a rather new development in history. So today we're working to heal the split. We're aware of the split, we're aware of some of its contours, and we want to put things back together again. And there are a lot of good authors, and I'm not going to take time to go through them now, but there are a lot of good people thinking about this question from all denominations and trying to bring religious experience and what they call praxis and love for the world and love for the poor, bringing that into the center of theology. So you don't have theology away from the world, away from the needs of the world and the loves of people's hearts and the suffering that needs to be addressed. Also, I'm not going to go through, but there was pushback throughout the tradition. So people, as the affections got lost and the heart got lost, there were groups of people throughout history in the West that said, oh, wait a minute, we're going to push back on this. And you have somebody like Bonaventure, you have mystical literature anywhere. Ignatius of Loyola pushed back. The Brethren of the Common Life pushed back. The Anabaptists, after the radical reform, they pushed back. If you know the poetry of the Anglican divines, George Herbert, John Donne, they pushed back. But this trajectory kept going that marginalized the heart, I think. And there are a lot of things in postmodernism that are helpful to putting this thing back together again. So they're kind of postmodern thought raises some interesting questions. And there's a focus on interiority again that's coming back. It's like, what's going on? Psychology has helped in many ways to think about what's going on inside me. What are my loves? What are my passions? We're aware now that theology is self-implicating. Okay, you can't do theology and be indifferent to the world. We see that that's no longer makes any sense whatsoever to be on some pinnacle somewhere thinking about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin and not caring about the world and what we love and what our passions are. There's a renewed attention to negative theology. There's a new attention to the limits of language. So what classical theology was, language is its tool, and yet now we're saying, well, yeah, it is, and it's good that we have all this language, but language never captures God. Language never comprehensively expresses what falling in love with God is about, or the mystical moment, and so we struggle. And when you have those kinds of human experiences, we can use words, but what other things? We dance, we write music. You do other things to try to even get close to what this kind of love is like. And there's a growing concern for justice. The liberation theologies, feminist theologies, they're like on the ground. If theology doesn't have a cachet on the ground in the world, it's not good theology. And Michael Paul Gallagher, who is a good reference for this theme of culture, he notes postmodernities. He says, it's a desire to heal inherited forms of loneliness, separation of self from society, and we all feel that. Reason from feeling, science from religion, man from woman, theology from spirituality. And again, we have a long list of people on both sides of the pond who are working and thinking about getting this together again. So while this is ridiculous that I ran through 2,000 years of history in 10 minutes, I just wanted to lay out that it hasn't always been this way. And some people think that spirituality will eventually go away as a term, as an idea, when theology starts doing a better job, a fuller job, that we won't need spirituality. You may have your own opinions. I think both terms are going to be around for a very long time. And so it's good for us to think about them. And I think most of us would be more comfortable with the word spirituality, yes? You kind of identify, you know, oh yeah, I get that, and you have a sense. Theology, not so much. And so one of the things I'm here to ask is why not? And I think these women, these medieval women, the women doctors of the church, they really do lay the gauntlet down. And my book, Making Sense of God, and I use the term grassroots theologian. Being a theologian is a right and a responsibility and a privilege of baptism. Not ordination, not degrees, and it's good we have all that, but the community is called by baptism to think intelligently about our experience of God. Open ourselves to the experience of God and then think about it, speak about it, write it down. Because if we don't, it doesn't get into the pipeline. It's just a private thing with me and God, which isn't good enough. So ultimately, this dichotomy between theology and spirituality is false. So I'd like to move on to talk about what I think are some ideas how theology and spirituality can help each other and why we need to keep them as partners. One of the things that happens, and you probably can give your own examples of this, is that theology and spirituality take potshots at each other. A lot, quite, actually, I think. And there's quite a bit of antagonism between theology and spirituality as we understand that. So instead of saying, you know, if you're spirituality, theology, instead of saying, well, who are you and what do you do and maybe I could learn from you, they are throwing stones at each other too often. And it's easy to caricature them. I just did a couple of them. And you can go to your own bailiwick and come up with your own caricatures of theology. So here are some of the things that we do, one against the other. So on the side of spirituality, these are straw dogs, all right? So these are set up, they're like the scientists and the atheists who set up this God that nobody ever even would recognize to knock it down. Okay, so on the side of spirituality, straw dogs include spirituality is a naively romantic version of the Christian life. Fuzzy, imprecise thinking. A rush to mystery and the ineffable. Instead of mystery being the last base that you hit, they accuse people of saying mystery is the first base you hit, which excuses you from figuring anything out intellectually. Bypassing reason, tough questions, and the hard work of rigorous scholarship. And it is work. But so is spirituality, if we're doing it right. When it comes to theology, it is ingenuous to say that it is always indifferent to falling in love with God, that it is always disdainful and condescending toward the ordinary believer, and some are, of course. It's wrong that it's lacking interest in the moral and spiritual life, or inattentive to spiritual growth in virtue and love, or that it's always unappreciative of the paradox and the messiness of existence. It's not always prone to avoid the challenges of daily life, and nor can you always say that it's convinced of its superiority as the only adequate way to discover and find language for God. So this is what we do to each other, and then you take a AK-47 and go and kill it or dismiss it. So it is good to make distinctions. All right, the famous French, distinguer pour unir. the only reason you make distinctions is it's helpful, but it's never to keep these in separate silos. It's eventually the goal is to put them back together again. And I think the things that unite spirituality and theology are much greater than the things that make them different. So they have a different lens, different color, and perhaps different perspectives that can complement each other. I don't know if some of you who have had the experience of reading a theologian or reading a spiritual writer who does both and really teaches you or affects you. For me, in graduate school, it was Karl Rahner initially. So you read Rahner, and I can't tell you as a young woman how quickening it was. I mean, it gave me a horrible, horrible headache to read, in either English or German. And so you're dying at the end of 40 pages. But if you stick with it, it is redeeming, it is touching, it is moving, it makes you fall in love with God in a way that many theologians do not. And there are many others like that. I'm sure we could go around the room and have your own experience. So Rahner refused this false dichotomy between theology and spirituality. He just refused to go there, and he ended up with this quite different way of doing theology and understanding theology. And so he said that there is no possibility of theology being uncommitted. So you can't have a theology that's not committed. And there's many, many ways to get to that. So a response to dead theology, if we think that dead theology was the reason why spirituality, came back with a vengeance, it's almost like the affections. I use this example that the affections, were in this pot, and we had a lid on it, and then someone put the gas on it, and it kept moving, blah, 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 and then in the 60s, and the lid blew off. And so, I mean, I have friends who went to India to ashrams, and it was a wild time when lots of things got released for good and ill that had not been given airtime. So another way to think about this is remembering the body. That this dismembering needs to be remembered and the community put back together again. So let me say I'm going to tick off points where I think spirituality can help theology. And the first one, I'm going to talk about spirituality's gifts to theology. And there are 5 of them. I'm going to tick them off here. Spirituality keeps theology in touch with Christian daily life. So theology is to support the faith of the community. It's to support it. It's not to undermine it or deaden it or to ignore it. So theology can lead us to greater love affair with God. And I think spirituality holds theology accountable to the fluid and open-ended nature of life. It is messy. We all know that it is messy. And it also helps theology maintain its eschatological impulse, this drive to the end, the final denouement. The second point, the reverse side of this coin is that spirituality prevents theology from turning in on itself. And when I get to the other, they're going to do that for each other. Inordinate attention and obsession with academic methods and trends. Spirituality says, hello, and it's not that we don't need specialization. We do. So, you want your brain surgeon to have special vocabulary and to know all those terms. The same with theology, but not to become OCD about it. Not to reject everything because we don't have our ducks lined up in this particular order. Spirituality invites theology to be mindful of mystical and liturgical as well as philosophical speech, language that points to the ultimate mysterious nature of reality. Spiritual texts contain wisdom that much theology has failed to incorporate. So dogma, where does dogma? Dogma is a 4-letter word for most Catholics, I think. But where does dogma come from? The love affair with God of the community. That's the source of dogma. And dogma should feed back into that source. And And I know, having taught the documents, justice documents of the church for one semester, and they're addressing a universal audience, and I'm an historian. There was not a single particular word about any particular thing in any document. I was like dead by the end of the semester, because they're talking in generalities that will be applicable to any setting. But if you want meat, and like what happened at the drugstore yesterday, that's not a place to get it. But we need to remember, or somehow remember, where dogma comes from and help us get back in touch with the life of that. Third, spirituality keeps prayer in the theological picture. And someone like Bernard Lonergan, who bases this initial of the theological process foundations, where the theologian falls in love with God. And that is important to remember, that the only reason one would do theology is that you fell in love with God. It doesn't mean you need to fall in love with God to do biblical exegesis or to do historical work. There are lots of pieces of theology that you don't need faith for. But theology proper, why would anyone do theology proper if they didn't believe in God? It doesn't make any sense. So it's inviting theologians to go back and acknowledge that beginning moment when you fall in love with God that leads you on this trajectory of doing theology. And I think prayer functions as a protection against the urge of religious language to claim total perspective. It's always, there's more, as negative theology. Nope, we do our best, we have libraries full of books, but we don't really get God in a box. You can't, no matter how many words you use, you can't get God in a box. Fourth, spirituality calls attention to the performative or self-implicating aspects of theology, and this is just kind of a riff on the same theme. I mean, it reminds theologians that their love with God, their own spiritual lives, can give life to their theology. So it provides mystical language, spiritual experience, provides an interpretive framework in which theologians can identify with the community and their experience and their encounter with God. And then finally, describing religious experience stretches language to its limits. Spirituality cautions theology against dry and uninspiring language. And it isn't that we need, everything has its dry and uninspiring moments, right? I mean, everything in life has dry and uninspiring moments. But you can't have it be the primary expression. You need to have that kind of specialization, but you also want theology to somehow catch the Spirit and help us by reading theology and doing theology to catch the Spirit and not kill the Spirit. Spirituality helps theology mitigate any excessive drive to logical consistency. We're required to get all of our ducks lined up, but we know that there are limits to getting all of our ducks lined up. And so we're getting our ducks lined up knowing that this is not the whole story, that there's more there, that we need to grapple with paradox, we need to grapple with the limits of language, with ecstasy, with desire. Then, to move on, a couple of more points about what theology gives to spirituality. And these are important, and I think the spirituality would benefit immensely if it would be more open, as theology would benefit immensely if it would be more open to spirituality. The first point is that I think theology can enrich spirituality by deepening spirituality's self-understanding. For example, do we ask hard questions? What am I doing when I pray? What am I doing when I work for justice? And it doesn't, you don't need this for salvation, but we have minds. We apply our minds brilliantly to so many areas of life. Why not God? Why not theology? Why not religious experience? What is the meaning of various religious symbols? Where do they come from? How am I to interpret and understand my experiences of God? So theology can assist in what sociologists call a thick description, that we're having experiences of God, but we're intelligent about it. And I think that's important. Second, theology's attention to spirituality's self-understanding allows Christians to live their lives more deeply. So you bring theory and argument into encounter with God. It's not just a cozy love affair between me and God in my little corner of my bedroom. It's bigger than that. It's bigger than that in terms of the world church. It's bigger than that in terms of using our minds. So theology's job is to untangle the grammar of religious experience and practice. Untangle it, sort it out. Because what? What does that help with? It helps with maybe preventing us from self-deception, would be one fruit of that, which would be very important. Third, theology helps spirituality attend to its language to avoid confusion and misleading expression. So it's sort of like linguistically, anything can't go. And so you need to pay attention to language. And if you're in tradition, if you're Muslim or Buddhist or Christian, there's a language, there's a whole system of symbols. We're inserting ourselves into a long tradition. And theology can say, is this spiritual practice adequate to the tradition? Is it adequate to the gospel? So it can question the spiritual experience. And it can ground personal spirituality in theological literacy, which I feel is so lost. One of the things that saddens me is that the primary mode that we think about ourselves, and it's so prevalent we don't even know it, are psychology and economics. That is how we understand ourselves. And I can tell in audiences, I can tell in my classroom, we no longer think theologically. We don't even know what that means anymore, to think theologically. Trinity, Christology, pneumatology, eschatology, ethics. We do not have the language or the idea much anymore at all. Fourth, theology functions as a gatekeeper against chronic subjectivism and solipsism. So there's quite a lot of me and God going on. You may remember Robert Bella's book in his analysis of religious experience, and one of his case studies was Sheila. I don't know if you remember, it's quite an old book now. But he said her religion, he named it Sheilaism. She was the only member of the community. And that's not unusual. That is not a rare phenomenon. And I can't tell you how many people say their church is their garden. And that's great. But if you have a whole community whose church is their garden for 500 years, guess what we won't have? You know, we won't have the community. We won't have the stories. We have to protect those. That's what liturgy is. We get together, we eat the food, and we tell the stories. That's the church's main job. That is the church's main job. There's lots of other jobs that the churches do, but that's the main job, is to get us together, break bread, and hear the stories. And it saves us from heterodoxy, from superstition, and without making judgments on people who have all different rich kinds of spirituality. Theology does say, if you're just a person of one in your faith community, theology will say, hello, you know, we have to look at this. It just doesn't matter how we put it together. There's a lot of different ways to put it together, but you can't just have Sheilaism. You can't just have your own, and theology helps us with that. One thing I love is that I think theology guards the strangeness and the uncomfortableness of Jesus Christ and the Trinity. Those of us, I'm a cultural Christian, born into a Christian family, baptized as a baby, and so it's easy to forget how utterly weird and strange and challenging Jesus Christ is. It's unfathomable, and if you are really at home and comfortable and that's all that's going on, look again, because you're missing the whole point. So Jesus' life ends with brutal beating and crucifixion. That's where Jesus' life ends. It's not a comfortable rag doll. And so I think historians and theology can say, look at this, you know, wake up. Don't be just using spirituality, you know, is my own way to survive the next day or survive the next crisis, even though it can and it should. But this is weird religion. I always think if anthropologists in 1,000 years after maybe Christianity is gone or, you know, very minimalized, how will they understand on Good Friday where a whole group of people come and worship in front of a crucified body? Just step outside that. Insane, right? What kind of people were they? And that should never, ever go away, that strangeness. And I think theology helps us hang on to that. And then finally, theology discerns and defends genuine prophetic and charismatic expression. and guards against the moral indifference of me and God. So religious experience needs testing. You need to ask all these questions. And so you can see how these two distinct disciplines, distinct parts of the community belong together. And they're good for each other, and they can help each other, they can reward each other, they can hold each other accountable. So we need both poetry and propositions. You know, who wants a life without Aristotle? Who wants a life without Plato? Not me. If we eliminate either of those, we are impoverished. So spirituality is primary in terms of theology comes out of it. So if you're doing a timeline, theology never comes first. So you meet God, you fall in love with God, and then out of that you step back and say, oh, okay, what's going on here? And that's the theological moment, which should in turn feed, invite, quicken the spiritual experience of falling in love with God. Okay, I have a long, wonderful quote from Thomas Merton, but I'm going to skip it. If anyone wants to read it at the end, and he brings in the idea of women. I'll just read one sentence because, you know, Thomas Merton's humor, he can be really so dry and funny. He says, dogmatic and mystical theology, or theology and spirituality, are not to be set apart in mutually exclusive categories as if mysticism were for saintly women and theological study were for practical but, alas, unsaintly men. So he introduces this issue of gender and wants these two things to be together. And so I'd like to close with a couple of thoughts about these medieval women. And I have, I guess I didn't realize this, but it's an ad to read my book because all the specifics of these four women are in the book that I'm not going to do tonight. But let me say some general things about these women. How did they do theology? How did they have the guts to do theology? First of all, I want to say that they were aristocrats or from wealthy merchant families. All right, so that's the first sociological fact about all of them. So anybody who, in any period of history, has the money and the time to write a book, they're not poor. All right, so they're not uneducated. They were also helped by influential, educated clergy. And this help came in a lot of forms. When a clergy person decided that this was the real McCoy, that God was really speaking through this woman, they, did a million things to help this woman stay alive, to help her from being condemned as a heretic and burned at the stake. So that might mean editing her words, asking her questions for things that weren't so clear. It might mean going to a inquisitional tribunal and defending the work and saying, oh, this is really of God, we should let this stand, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, mistakes were made and people died. But the texts that we have were often due to this advocacy. And women, we know that educated men gave women books. We know that they had conversations. We know that the male houses had libraries. We know these women had books. So there's a lot of back and forth and support from the men that allowed women to write and survive. There's also kind of being at the right place in the right time. So women that did survive and women whose writings the church held up, they showed up at a time when the church needed them for whatever reason. So in Hildegard's time, the church is fighting the Cathars, and wow, there's Hildegard. And they have her text, and they read it, and they need her because they need to create a kind of Christianity that was as strict, as compelling, as difficult as the Cathars. So the church was in such bad shape that droves of people were leaving for this other movement because it was really taking Christianity seriously, too seriously in some cases. But anyway, so the church, Catherine of Siena, the popes needed her. So it wasn't just something that happened outside of history. They had a lot of guts. These women are models of courage. And I encourage women, because we have not been theologians. Our voice has not been out there. And I don't just mean professional theologians. I mean everyone in this room. So we need courage. We need to say, I am going to speak and analyze and think about and categorize my experience of God and get it out there, even if it's just in a group of other people or in a journal. I'm going to do that work. I'm going to commit because my baptism demands that I do that. They pushed the authority. Women were not allowed to speak about God in public. And they did it anyway. And some of them lost their lives and some of them didn't. But the two reasons that women were defended was the Magnificat, God speaks through the poor and the lowly. So that was one reason women were allowed to keep speaking, and the Holy Spirit. When you see the defense of women, it's Holy Spirit, Holy Spirit. They always go back and say, the Spirit speaks where the Spirit wills, and the Spirit is speaking in this woman. So I recommend them as people for all kinds of reasons that kept a close awareness of the union of theology and spirituality. A huge part of this is that women were not allowed to go to the university. And it influences them. Not only does their daily life influence them, which is another reason, their theology is filled with daily life because they didn't have anything else, in some sense. That's a little bit overdrawn. But what do you do at university? What does university do for us? It's a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. And, I wouldn't trade it for anything. But what does it do? It gives you the grid about a subject. So you go to chemistry class and you say, well, at this point in history, this is how we study chemistry. Or you go to a poetry class and say, this is how we analyze poetry today. Or you go to a Bible class. The women didn't have the grid. So what happens when they start doing theology? If you have the grid, you generally write within the grid. And there's nothing wrong with that. And some people that go to university get outside the grid. Most don't. Because you're told this is how we do it. And it's often very good the way we do it. But the women didn't have the grid. So they're thrown back on themselves in a way that I think makes them very user-friendly. And I have some wonderful examples. The Trinity for Catherine of Siena. The Father is the table. Obviously, Christ is the food. And from her life as a servant in her own home, her parents were trying to get her to marry, and then she wouldn't do it. And so they said, okay, she's the 24th of 25 children, plus cousins, and everybody else was in the house. So they said, okay, you're not going to do what we want you to do. You be Cinderella. You serve, you get the fire going, you cook, you serve, you clean up. And so the Holy Spirit becomes the waiter. Where in the tradition have you read that the Holy Spirit was a waiter? So there are like Hildegard's, and although Hildegard, there were others in the 12th century who did this, but Hildegard's, cosmic awareness and this idea of greening, this viriditas, that became a key theological principle. Very maddening because it has so many meanings. You can't nail it down. But, Teresa of Avila and Teresa of Lisieux amazingly turned horrible cultures, Spanish culture, French Catholic culture in the 19th century, the most unattractive thing I've ever read about. It was horrendous. And by the end of their lives, they just flipped the whole thing upside down. I don't know how they did it. How do you reverse what it means to be a human being within your own culture in one lifetime? It's amazing. And so they teach us through their groundedness in experience and their courage to write. And then I will close. I have another long quote that anybody wants, but anyway, Elizabeth Johnson received a leadership award from the LCWR, and you may all have read this already in last August of 2014. And she talks about, she says, clearly my work engages theology done by men and does so with critical appreciation. But I am convinced that this is not enough for the church today and tomorrow. The submerged female half of the church, indeed of the human race, is rising. And the faith we pass on to the next generations will be poorer if women's insights are ignored. In taking this path, I and today's cohort of women theologians are charting a new path. One cannot overestimate the impact of Vatican II, which opened the doors of theological study to laypersons. While excellent theology continues to be done by ordained priests, all kinds of new questions, methods, and understandings are now blossoming, fed by the experience of the laity, women and men alike. That's us. I take this leadership award to be in part a recognition of this seismic development. With gratitude, I accept it as also paying tribute to women who do theology in this vein and to men whose work has an eye for inclusive justice. So I think in the medieval women, one of the things that is so clear to me is that the bottom line of theology is care for the poor. And these are, quote unquote, for the most part, cloistered women. Now, Catherine of Siena was a laywoman. But it's amazing, again, and both of the Carmelites dying to have a ministry. Teresa of Lisieux would have given her teeth to go to Singapore. The Carmelites had set up a mission, and she so wanted to go there. And Thérèse, too. Teresa of Avila is furious that she can't have a public ministry. I mean, she ends up having a public ministry, but it's not an acknowledged public ministry. And so, because of their grounding in the source of their theology, the bottom line of every theological anything is love of neighbor. And it just comes up over and over and over as a leitmotif through all of it. So I would like to give more examples from their work, but the women, I think, as I've spent my whole life with them, how lucky am I? This is how I spend my days. And they're real women, filled with doubt and contradiction and flights of fancy. And if you have a really, really logical mind, they will drive you crazy. When I have graduate students who are really, really logical, and Teresa says, and they free associate, and a word from the Bible comes up, and then they go riffing on all the words, and then you're like, oh my God, save me. And Teresa will say, oh, I forgot where I was. And I mean, it's so scattershot in some ways. And yet, the depth of their theologies is, for me, unmistakable in terms of what they offer if you give them the time and energy. Their lives were not the lives of academics. And I remember one passage, Catherine, the Pope needs help and is calling, and this friend of hers, an Augustinian who had given up the academy and gone as a hermit, and he was in the woods, and the Pope was calling him to come and help. And he said, no. He said, I'm just going to be in the woods. And she just went after him. It's great to be in the woods, but when the world needs you, get your butt here. And there was just no ifs, ands, or buts. She was so angry with him because he chose the peacefulness and the orderedness of the hermitage instead of coming when she thought he should have come. So they're imaginative. They wake you up. You can't read them and have dead feelings. You just can't, or you're a robot or something. So I think it's wonderful that they're here, and I remember giving a workshop on women theologians, and one of the women at the workshop said, they're back. And we say thank you and amen. Thank you for your attention. That's great.
She's willing to take questions, so we have a microphone on each side of the room, so you can make your way there and ask whatever you'd like to ask, and you might hear some more stories.
Mm-hmm. Stories are good. And feel free to share your experience of encountering these women. I'm sure many of you have read them. And
you've done a marvelous job of whetting our appetite to fall in love with God, whether we're spiritual or theological. Can you clarify what your definition of God is? What's your description of God?
Silence. Theological, I think of God in terms of the totality of reality. And that has a bit, my husband is a process theologian, and so I am influenced by that. I was very moved by Whitehead's, he was a British mathematician, theologian, and we think of God as all-knowing, all-powerful, the aseity, all the all thing. And, that never did much for me in terms of understanding who God was. And Whitehead's concept is different in terms of saying, what is the godness of God that makes God different from us? And as my husband explained it or talked about it, and that God is the one the only one, who is capable of holding within God's self every single molecule of everything that ever was, is, and will be. Every suffering, every stubbed toe, every trip to space, every tear, everything, that God holds all of that in God's self. And that was a powerful image for me that did something that these others did not. And then the other piece is this negative theology, the apophatic, is to know that in the end, we just stand silent. There are no words. So keeping those together. Lots of words. The more words, the better. The more names for God, the better. Thomas Aquinas says that. So if you can have 1,000 names for God, 10,000 is better. But then as you move on, then the words, you fall silent. So you have both moments of silence and awe and language.
Is there one of the women that you connect with in a more particular way or see as more successful in terms of bridging these two strains?
Wow. I get asked a lot, do I have a favorite woman? And the answer is always no. I find some of them more difficult. I find Hildegard very difficult. She's very cerebral. And she lives in a symbolic world that is, artists just get her like that. They kind of, I get Hildegard, and I'm like looking at the text thinking, what is she talking about? I don't know. I mean, it's hard because they're from different centuries, and so that makes the question almost impossible, because Teresa is in the early modern period in the 16th century, so in a way she's more user-friendly to us. She's very psychologically sophisticated in a way a 12th century person wouldn't have a clue. And maybe that's why I find Hildegard harder, because of the world that she lived in. So I don't really know that I would say one is more successful. I like the palette that they all work at this in their own way, and some of them have common themes, like I mentioned some of the common themes, that love of neighbor is always the bottom line. But I don't know that any one of them succeeds. It's like apples and oranges for me, so I'm sorry I can't answer that. Maybe somebody else could address that, who knows all the women's works.
How do you see Pope Francis addressing this tension between spirituality and theology today, right now, and then animating the church around that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not a student of Francis. I don't follow him in terms of reading everything that he writes, and I do know that the two big strains in his life of being a Jesuit and Francis. So in that sense, those are two very rich strains of people who put it together. I mean, very rich. And I think he's soaked in both of them from an early period. So I think that would be pretty reliable in terms of his formation. And clearly the spirituality side is coming forward. And, the existential involvement is coming forward. And I think he has a good vision of this. And it's so, at the level that he's dealing with, the complexity of a global church is so difficult, and there's so many pieces of spirituality and theology. But it's the most promising leadership I've seen in a long time. So I think he'll help us in a lot of different ways. I think we have to do our own work as well, but I think he's from another kind of universe from past leadership, in a sense, and if Francis and Ignatius are in his blood, I think the union is in both of them, and I don't see him teasing that apart at all. I mean, as a priest, as a bishop, he's trained theologically, and he was probably trained in a very separated way, because that's how the training was. And yet, if you pray with Ignatius and Francis, you can't ever stay in an isolated theoretical world of theology, because they just won't let you.
Maybe my question can follow that. I'm curious, if you don't mind telling us, what led you to this path? What led you on this academic path? Do you mind telling us, as a child, how you got directed into it?
No, and not at all. Thanks for the question. A couple of things. I had an experience in second grade that I remember in detail. It was a Eucharist at midnight mass in my local parish. I was 7. And so, I mean, I've never forgotten it, so obviously that I've never forgotten it since I was 7, it's a factor. And then I studied French in college and minored in theology and fell in love with it. And the other piece I would mention are people. I was privileged to study with a Canadian Basilian, Walter Principe, at the Pontifical Institute for Medieval Studies. And wow, the path was just laid out for him. And just a lot of teachers who, I mean, I was older when I went back for a doctorate because I didn't think I could save my soul and be an academic. And by the time you're almost 40, you kind of know right from wrong. And I thought, man, well, I better not risk this because I'm not going to come out whole in this, And I was a campus pastor at a big university, so I knew the university community. So I thought, well, by the time I'm 40, maybe if I can do this in 3 or 4 years, maybe I'll make it. But I had professors, Jake Donahue, Bernard Lonergan. I had professors who were able to put theology and faith together. And I was amazed at that. And they weren't just ordinary people. These were like, wow, I mean, unbelievable scholars. And so they witnessed to the possibility, because, you lose your faith the first year of graduate school. It just goes out the window. I mean, because why would you believe? Because you know all this stuff now. So it's very unsettling in many ways. But then if you have professors in front of you who are not making fun of the faith. I have a lot of colleagues who make fun of the faith or make fun of anybody who believes in God. So the witness of that. So I think people is very crucial, and that's a lesson for all of us, that who we are is inviting people or disinviting people into this world of theology and spirituality. So I would say the witness of my professors. And I had some very bad professors too, of course, but an amazing number of wonderful professors.
I would like to thank you very much for this lecture on spirituality and theology. I think you certainly stimulated me. I think it's a lot of food for thought for women in particular to move our faith forward, to advance, and in using these two wonderful experiences together. And I'd like to be sure that I understand how you were explaining it. And to me, Eucharistic adoration combines both. It's a very spiritual experience to sit and be with God, love Him, worship Him, feel Him. But it's based on a theology that goes right back to the Last Supper and is so deep, so rich, so wonderful. Yeah, I don't know if that's what you meant, but
You could give the lecture next time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. It seems like I came with the thinking that we were really going to focus on hearing the women's story, which might go underrepresented, and we might not know the women's stories as intimately as you've had the privilege to study. So my thinking is we came to hear the women's story, and yet, as you demonstrated, we hear about the men who have advocated for them, and we hear about the men's stories and their theologies and how that allows women to speak. So my question for you is, I'm an educator myself. I teach grade 8 and have the privilege of influencing young women and men. How do we continue to tell the women's stories and acknowledge the role that men might play, but how do we let women stand on their own and tell those women's stories? And how do we ourselves as women stand on our own to validate our own story and tell our own experience of God?
Okay, great question. Well, I mean, one way is to tell the stories, to read their lives, to read their words. We have texts. I'm not exactly sure how to respond. My basic premise is that we are a community. And so no matter what, no matter who's on the ins and who's on the outs, we're still a community and we need each other as men and women. And unfortunately, the history has been very unkind to women. So from that perspective, we have an enormous amount of work to make up. And I think that has a variety of moments. I think calling a spade is important. These women would not have survived without their male colleagues. But also, a lot of the men's spirituality wouldn't have developed as it did without the women forming them. So there's mutual formation. But in terms of who had power to keep you alive, women didn't have that power, and still don't in most of the world. So I think naming that is an important first step. Like one of the things that I didn't mention it tonight, but we should be, and I don't mean this in a morbid, maudlin sort of way, but we should be in constant mourning, constant weeping for the theologies, the symphonies, the poetry, the dance, the business acumen that the world does not have. We should never, ever, ever get over that. It's an irreparable loss forever. It's gone. It never was allowed to exist. It never bloomed in most cases, and when it did bloom, it was burned, it was tossed, it was shredded, it was gone. And we all hold responsibility for that. And it's awful. I can't hardly talk about it. It's just like, whoa, all that is gone and never existed because of misogynism, because of hate for women. Or just the arrogance that women didn't count. And, I'm a historian. I don't throw stones at the past. I don't say to Thomas Aquinas, well, why the hell didn't you figure out that women were important and equal? No, I mean, historians are going to look at us in 1,000 years and say, why the hell didn't you save the planet? And we'll go, what? I didn't know we were doing this. I didn't do much to help, but it's gone. And so, it's not to throw stones, but it's to call a spade about this loss. And then I think to tell the stories about the women today and be grateful that we have some texts, that we have some stories, and through this to encourage, women, but none of us stand alone. So I think of women supporting other women. I think often women are women's worst enemies because a lot of women don't like women to stand up and stand alone, and because it's scary. It's scary for all of us. So I don't ever think of autonomy as a goal, and I think because of the history of women, we're going to need to put women forward for millions of years to make up for lost time. We're just going to have to do that. And it is happening. I'm standing up here. And that's a recent thing. It's a recent thing. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's I don't want to let go of the fact that we're in this together. And women will never rise without men understanding and supporting. And men should never rise without women understanding and supporting. We just can't do it one or the other. And that's kind of a hard sell when you've been invisible for 6,000 years or something. So I don't know, maybe other people in the audience would have help for her teaching. I mean, it's such an important group of people, these 8th graders, it's such an important time in their lives. So I think telling the truth is one thing I go by, to just tell the truth and the sadness, the glory, the wonder, and let them deal with it themselves and just love them, I guess. Thanks for the question.
Hi, sorry, thanks a lot for your talk. I have a specific question because I'm guessing you probably studied the life of Saint Thérèse of Lisieux more than I have, but from many people hearing lots of talks and people referencing her life as an example, they talk about the idea of living out our faith in full through the little things that we do in life. And this sort of goes to my confusion regarding sort of the idea of spiritual fruit, and I'll expand on what I mean. I read a New York Times article from a journalist who was sort of criticizing Christians, and he's saying, don't you hate the annoying Christian whose only offer to help with anything is to pray for your problem. He says, they choose the one kind of help that doesn't require them to get off their sofa.
Right.
And then he references Jesus Christ and his teaching about the idea of how a tree is judged by its fruit. Right, and he questions sort of what fruit comes out of it. And at the same time, I understand that, for example, like a cloistered nun, or there's a lot of spiritual fruit that comes out of it. But when I read something like that, it sort of makes sense to me that as Christians we're called to action, right? We're called to make tangible differences to make society and ourselves better. So I just wanted to ask, sort of when you look at the life of Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, right? What do you what do you really feel are the fruits that we can really look to trying to emulate in our own lives, right? In terms of sort of spiritual fruits. It's a little bit of a confusing question, but it's also
it's a good question. It's an excellent question.
But yeah.
Thérèse was tough. I'm a medievalist, and so when I, was 4 doctors of the church, I thought, oh my God, I have to do Thérèse. I've never studied Thérèse. And I'm not drawn to Thérèse. I've never wanted to study Thérèse. But I thought, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go in with an open mind. I'm going to read everything that was written about her. I'm going to read everything. I'm going to let her speak. And the one thing I would say in response to your question is the difficulty or the challenge of learning from people whose lives are so different. I mean, how much different from your life is Thérèse's life? It's unimaginable. And I think we need to honor that. So in some ways, for an incarnational religion like Christianity, lifestyle matters because God works through history. So your spirituality is deeply forever embedded in whether you are single, married, gay, straight, children, no children, ordained, vowed, whatever matters. All right, so we're not sort of in bubbles somewhere where that doesn't count. And she was in a Carmelite cloister, and we're not. So I think that's just acknowledging that. But in a way, another way, and I don't know, I have never said this before, and we can test it, but it seems like, in a way, she's a microcosm of a bigger world. And I was pleasantly surprised. I mean, the one thing that gave me pause about Thérèse is that people like her from every walk of life, from every economic bracket, from every culture, she just talks to people, for everywhere, and really smart, thoughtful, holy people. And I'm thinking, well, all these people can't be wrong, right? So there has to be something there that I'm not seeing, because I had never studied it. But the thing, I'll tell you the one thing that moved me the most about Thérèse, and it happened in the last 18 months of her life after she got sick. And I use Teresa of Avila as an example. She grew up, and I don't have time tonight to do this, but she grew up in a horrible culture. the French Revolution was 100 years before her time, and the ripples of that were still affecting the church profoundly. And the Roman Catholic Church took sides with the monarchy, and she was part of that wealthy, elite, aristocratic world that condemned Protestants and Jews and anybody, any revolutionaries. They were all bad people in that family. And so this piety arose that your job was that you were specially chosen to sacrifice your life so that those bad people would get back to God. And as a child, the piety of 19th century Catholicism, you checked off every sacrifice you made. It was like, a board where you, every day as a child, you said, I did this and this and this and this and this. So you kept tabs about all these merits to help all these awful people. And by the end of her life, and she was steeped in that, she also was steeped in a loving family. I mean, there was a great love in her family. But by the end of her life, she let that whole thing go. And I'm like, well, how did she do that? How did she figure out that that's not the right God? That's not a God at all that anybody wants anything to do with. And her meditation on the cross, and I recommend, this idea of the face, of each other's faces and the face of God from the scriptures. She studies the face, she just dwells on the face of the crucified, as many of the women do. Julian of Norwich would be another person. And through this attention to the face of the crucified, she realized, like Pope Francis, that God is just mercy, 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 mercy. And she never was told that in her life. And so for her to live and grow in a culture, and then in the last 18 months of her life, completely turn it upside down to something more beautiful and more true, is amazing to me and draws me to her. And the fact that she was cloistered is that she couldn't go to Singapore. She wanted to go to Singapore. And she wanted to go and be in a place where she could work for other cultures. And she was not allowed, to do that. And by the 19th century, women were more mobile. But so I think in a strange way, with qualifications because of the different lifestyle, they did love the world. And I think they can teach us to love the world. And we have to do the work of finding out what that means for you and for me. That's genuine and loving.
It also sort of changes because we are lay people,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so we have to find the way of living our faith in our studies or whatever, our workplace and our families and stuff.
Exactly. And her vocation was just a very specialized kind of vocation. But I don't think, I to be honest, I wish there was a whole bag of 1,000 years of writings by lay people. I'd love that, but we don't have it. And there is so it's what we have. We use what we have. But there's a lot of wisdom in what we have, but we need to do this translation to the lay life ourselves. Yeah. And I think there's, if there's wisdom there, we can do it. If we all go down deep, you get the water at the bottom of the well that we all share, as Merton says. So it's a lot of work, though. You have to work at that. And I agree completely. I think Teresa would have agreed that, just sort of sitting on the couch praying isn't enough.
Thank you.
Yeah. Not to knock prayer, of course. We're not knocking prayer. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to get my stuff and go. I'm going to take my water with me.
You just have the sense we could go on and lots more stories. She will still be here for a little bit, and we can do that in a few minutes. But right now, I'd like to invite forward Dr. David Perrin, who's a member of the Religious Studies Department here at St. Jerome's University, happens to be a good friend and colleague of Dr. Dreyer. And he's a past president of the International Society for the Study of Christian Spirituality. So a good person to come and formally thank our speaker on our behalf.
Thanks, Christina, and thank you, Elizabeth, for your presence here with us tonight, and such an excellent talk, the inaugural Resurrectionist lecture on Christian spirituality. What a wonderful way to be introduced to this new series at St. Jerome's University with such a prominent scholar and lively and depth-filled person in our midst. I've known Elizabeth and her husband John Bennett for quite a few years, and what you got tonight was the authentic truth and transparency of their own lives. So the theme this year was a culture of encounter, the lecture series this year at St. Jerome's University. And what an opportunity to encounter that we've had this evening. The encounter between spirituality and theology. The encounter with 4 significant women that have contributed to both in such striking and meaningful ways. And, might I add, the encounter with a 5th woman who equally has brought us into the depth of that relationship in a personal, authentic, and transparent way. And Elizabeth, thank you once again for leading us personally on this path through your own storytelling, reflection, and academic expertise. What we have been able to experience tonight is an encounter with the past, considering the present, which truly does launch us into the future. The future, the first of the Resurrectionist lectures in Christian spirituality. And so, Elizabeth, I would like to thank you for facilitating this journey, this launch, this newness, to help us understand that each and every one of us here might appreciate the fact that we all have something to contribute to theology's quest. And that is the understanding of how God is alive in each and every one of our lives. At some level, therefore, I think what you've suggested to us is that we are all theologians, and we ought to consider ourselves as such, inasmuch as we reflect on the movements of God's Spirit, God's love in our each and every personal life that we live. God's Spirit and God's love in the daily activities of our life, the eating and the drinking, the dancing and the celebrating, the mourning and the disappointing, the birthing and the burying. Thank you, Elizabeth, for taking us along this historical encounter of our faith so that we can encounter our faith in a new way today and into the future. Spirituality and theology, 2 sides of one coin. The heart and the intellectual, the poetry and the propositions, the everyday and the academic. In our lives, there is no split between all of these realities, and you've shown us that so well. Thank you for bringing us to this moment, this encounter, to our attention in such a clear way of 4 women, Catherine of Siena, Teresa of Avila, Hildegard of Bingen, and Teresa of Lisieux. We take much home this evening for reflection. We take as well your own spirit along with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. So a few more things to deal with before we finish up this evening. First, I want to sincerely thank the Congregation of the Resurrection, who created this lecture to provide us with the opportunity to think about the meaning and significance of Christian spirituality. And I want to thank again Father Murray for being here, and there are other members of the congregation who are here with us this evening. I want to remind you to sign up in the foyer if you want to receive the latest information about this lecture series and receive some regular emails about upcoming speakers. And you also can let us know if you'd be interested to hear about other lectures and events that are taking place at St. Jerome's this year and coming up next year in our anniversary year. Every year, St. Jerome's University is pleased to present a program of speakers to the community, and we're able to provide these lectures to the community at no charge, thanks to the generosity of so many partners and supporters. So if you too would like to support these lectures, there are some donation envelopes available. I think there are some in the chairs here in Siegfried, and there are some on the table in the foyer. And I want to continue to thank so much all of those who have given so generously to us. If you missed it on the way in and you need something for, Easter baskets on the way out, you might stop at our table and Katarina will sell you some wonderful Fairleys traded products. They're available for sale by our Social Justice Committee. And finally, I want you to know that the next lecture in this series is going to take place on Friday, April the 24th. Bishop Donald Bolin, who is Bishop of the Diocese of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, will be here to deliver this year's Scarborough Mission Lecture, and it's entitled A Church in Dialogue, Pope Francis and the Summons to Ecumenical Interfaith and Cultural Conversations. Bishop Bolin is currently the co-chair of the International Anglican Roman Catholic Commission for Unity and Mission, co-chair of the International Methodist Catholic Dialogue, a member of the International Evangelical Catholic Dialogue, and a member of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity. And in 2008, he was awarded the Cross of St. Augustine by the Archbishop of Canterbury for his service to relations between the Catholic Church and the Anglican Communion. He is absolutely suited and appropriate and to come and speak to us on what it means to respond to Pope Francis's call to encounter and to dialogue with contemporary culture, science, non-believers, other religious traditions, and other Christian communities. We hope you can join us. I want to thank you for coming this evening. Many blessings to you and your families in this Easter season. You have a safe trip home tonight, and until next time, good night.